language out there. So I'm going to say that an agent has practical wisdom just to the extent that she is excellent with respect to practical reasoning, and that an agent engages in practical reasoning insofar as she reasons about which course of action she ought to pursue. So I'm going to say that eudaimonia is such that an agent achieves eudaimonia just to the extent that she has a flourishing human life. What I think is interesting is that Islam, Buddhism, and Christianity all say that the flourishing human life consists in a life of surrender. And when I say surrender or self-abnegation, that's going to be rather difficult to work out exactly what that means, but to some extent it's going to mean disregarding the interests of the self qua self. So I conceive of my project as having three parts, the last part being the least well-developed. The first part is going to be connecting practical reason to eudaimonia, or human flourishing. The second part consists in connecting eudaimonia to surrender, because that is not an obvious connection to draw. And the third part, connecting the philosophical analysis of practical reason, eudaimonia, and surrender to so-called neuropsychology. Satisfying our desires is the goal of practical reasoning. Basically, you engage in a means-ends analysis. You figure out what is the best means to satisfying that desire. That process of figuring out the best means, that's what practical reasoning consists in. The next view is the Kantian view, and far from saying that reason is the servant of the passions, the Kantian view tells us that reason itself, the faculty of reason, is able to tell us what we ought to do. So desires, the sentiments, they can get in the way insofar as they might cloud our judgment about what reason itself tells us we ought to do in the situation. I'm actually not in favor of either of these views. I am a fan of what I call a eudaimonistic or an Aristotelian view. It's not that I agree with Aristotle on everything, but I agree with him to the extent that he says practical reasoning is a thought process that aims at eudaimonia. So at the end of the first part, I'm expecting to conclude that eudaimonistic accounts of practical reason are better than Humean or Kantian accounts. But if we take this view that, practical reasoning involves aiming at eudaimonia, that's part of the structure of practical reasoning, is aiming at eudaimonia, this obviously presents the question, what is eudaimonia, or what is human flourishing? And so, according to these three major world religions, Islam, Buddhism, and Christianity, eudaimonia consists in surrender. So, if eudaimonia consists in surrender, practical reason aims at eudaimonia, then practical reason aims at surrender. Then, obviously, the question is, how can we give an account of practical reasoning that accommodates the view that practical reasoning aims at surrender? And thus, in the second part of the project, I'll do two things. Survey the accounts of surrender given by representatives of Islam, Buddhism, and Christianity. For Islam, I'm going to focus on Al-Ghazali. That's the plan right now, though I'm open to suggestions. For Buddhism, I've got various sources. That's certainly the tradition that I know the least about. And for Christianity, I'll focus on Aquinas. And then in the final part of my project, I would like to look at the neuropsychological literature and, as I said, consider how that comports with the findings about eudaimonia and surrender. And I think that if philosophers who are worried about practical reasoning, worried about promoting eudaimonia, or are going to be taken seriously in the mainstream, we're going to have to interact with this neuropsychological literature